Before the jet age screamed across the Korean sky, the air still trembled with the deep, mechanical growl of spinning propellers. It was the sound of another world, one that refused to die quietly. In the summer of 1950, when North Korean forces stormed across the 38th parallel, the United States and its allies were caught off guard. Jet fighters were the future, fast, powerful, and sleek, but the future wasn't ready yet. The shiny new F-80 Shooting Stars and F-84 Thunderjets looked good on the runway, but they couldn't stay in the air long enough to matter. Their engines overheated, their fuel vanished in minutes, and their fragile frames demanded long, perfect airstrips that barely existed in a country being torn apart by war. So, the world turned back to machines that had already fought one global firestorm and somehow survived. They were the old warriors of the propeller age, rugged, oil-stained, patched together from storage hangars and forgotten airfields across the Pacific. They had names that echoed from the skies of Europe and the islands of the Pacific: Mustang, Corsair, Skyraider. Each was built for another war, but called once again to fight one last time. The Korean War wasn't supposed to be their stage. It was supposed to be the dawn of jet age, clean, modern, invincible. Instead, what followed was a clash between eras, a brutal test that proved that courage and craftsmanship still mattered more than technology. For every jet that streaked above 30,000 feet, there was a prop-driven fighter clawing through mountain valleys, engines roaring at treetop level, dodging gunfire so close the pilots could see the faces of the men shooting at them. These were not sleek machines of the future. They were beasts of burden, guardians of soldiers trapped below, and symbols of a generation that refused to vanish. They came from all sides. The Americans brought the F-51 Mustang, a legend of World War II, resurrected from storage. Its pilots barely believing they'd fly it again. The Marines sailed in with the mighty F4U Corsair, its bent wings gleaming under the carrier lights, ready for another Pacific fight. The Air Force sent a strange twin fuselage creature, the F-82 Twin Mustang, half machine, half experiment, hunting enemy bombers in the night skies over Seoul. From the decks of aircraft carriers, the A-1 Skyraider, slow, heavy, and unstoppable, became the soldier's best friend. And across the battlefield, North Korean and Soviet pilots scrambled into Yak-9S and IL-10's relics of their own victory in the Second World War, desperate to hold back the advancing UN tide. For a few short months in 1950 and 1951, the skies over Korea became something unique, time machine of clashing generations. Propellers and jets fought side by side, and sometimes against each other. It was the last time men looked out through spinning blades and saw the face of an enemy rushing toward them. The old pilots, many of them veterans of Europe and the Pacific, said the Korean War felt different. There were no parades, no grand declarations, only mountains, mud, and sudden death. The air was thick with smoke and dust. The war moved fast, unpredictable, like a storm that couldn't be controlled. Yet inside that chaos, these old propeller fighters found purpose again. They weren't fast enough to chase MiGs, but they didn't need to be. They became the eyes, the hands, and the guardians of the men below. They flew so low their propellers kicked up dirt. They strafed tanks, blew apart convoys, and dropped napalm within yards of friendly lines. Their engines screamed as bullets tore through wings and oil sprayed across cockpits, but still they flew. To the soldiers on the ground, the rumble of a piston engine meant salvation. When the F-51 seconds arrived overhead, you could see exhausted faces lift from foxholes. When the Corsairs roared down through flak, Marines pinned under fire began to hope again. And When the Skyraiders came lumbering, massive, almost prehistoric, every man knew someone up there was willing to die so they might live another hour. But for all their bravery, these machines carried a shadow. Each sortie could be their last. They were slow targets in a world that had suddenly become fast. Every day, pilots watched MiGs climb higher, faster, sleeker, and wondered if the age of the propeller had finally run out of sky. Yet even as the jets claimed the headlines, it was these piston-driven fighters that did the grinding, merciless work, the kind of work that wins wars, not newspapers. They loitered for hours, circling, searching, protecting. Their propellers turned against time itself, spinning out the final chapters of an era written in sweat, fuel, and courage. When history looks back at the Korean War, it often sees the first jet versus jet duels, the dawn of the modern fighter age. But beneath that silver gleam lies a quieter, more human story of men and machines that weren't supposed to be there, yet refused to be forgotten. This is their story. The 6 prop-driven fighters that fought not for glory but for survival, the last roar of the propeller age. When the Korean War erupted in June 1950, the United States Air Force found itself standing at the edge of a new era with the wrong kind of airplanes. Jet fighters were the pride of the modern age, fast, sleek, symbols of post-war progress, but they came with one fatal weakness: endurance. Their fuel tanks drained like hourglasses, and their fragile engines choked on the dust and debris of Korea's rough, makeshift runways. So, in the desperate early weeks of the war, the call went out not for the future, but for the past. In forgotten hangars across America and the Pacific, mechanics pulled back dusty tarps and rediscovered the aircraft that had once ruled the skies of Europe and the Pacific, the P-51 Mustang. But this time, the name had changed. In the new Air Force system, it was now the F-51, the same soul, but a different world. For many of the young pilots, it felt almost absurd. They'd trained to fly jets, to embrace the future, and now they were climbing into machines built before most of them had graduated high school aircraft, with manual controls, narrow landing gear, and engines that still leaked oil after every mission. The Mustang had become a relic, but in Korea, relics had a way of proving their worth. The F-51's return was born out of necessity, not nostalgia. In those first chaotic months, United Nations troops were pushed to the edge of the peninsula, the infamous Busan perimeter. There, surrounded and outnumbered, the ground forces needed close air support every minute of every day. Jets couldn't stay long enough to help. The Mustang, with its long range and rugged landing gear, could. It wasn't glamorous work. The Mustang pilots didn't chase enemy aces through clouds or duel at 20,000 feet. They flew low, so low they could see the faces of North Korean soldiers through the smoke. They strafed convoys, dropped napalm on tank columns, and fired rockets into mountainsides that hid entrenched artillery. Each mission blurred the line between courage and suicide. The Packard-built Merlin engine screamed through the valleys, its liquid-cooled heart beating furiously against gravity and gunfire. At first, the results were devastating for the enemy. The North Korean advance, unstoppable just days before, began to slow. Trucks burned on the roads, bridges collapsed into rivers, and columns of infantry scattered under the relentless roar of those resurrected Mustangs. To the soldiers trapped below, the sound of those engines became the sound of hope, old iron wings shielding modern lives. But the price was high. The same liquid-cooled engine that gave the F-51 its grace in World War II was now its greatest weakness. One burst of small arms fire could puncture a coolant line and turn the aircraft into a flying torch. And in Korea, anti-aircraft fire was everywhere, from the hills, from the trees, even from trucks pretending to surrender. By the end of 1951, over 170 Mustangs had been lost to ground fire alone. Still, the pilots kept flying. Some came straight from jet units, unfamiliar with the quirks of the propeller fighter. Others were veterans, men who had flown these very machines over France and the Philippines 5 years earlier. For them, Korea felt like a strange dream second war in the same cockpit. Only this time, the enemy was faster, the sky colder, the stakes smaller, yet somehow more personal. They learned to fly smarter, not faster. Mustangs operated from rough forward strips, sometimes nothing more than a patch of steel mesh on muddy ground close to the front lines. That proximity meant shorter transit times, faster turnaround, and near-continuous coverage for the infantry below. One squadron could launch dozens of sorties a day, the pilots returning covered in grime and exhaustion, refueling, rearming, and going again. Each time they took off, they knew the odds were shrinking. Many of these pilots formed quiet bonds with the soldiers they protected. Letters and field notes describe infantrymen carving "Thank you, Mustang" into bomb casings or waving at the aircraft as they passed low overhead. The airmen, in turn, recognized that they were no longer just fighters, they were guardians. Each run mattered, each rocket had a name. By late 1951, the balance of air power had shifted. Jets like the F-80 Shooting Star and F-86 Sabre began dominating the skies, driving the old Mustangs to lower altitudes and harsher missions. But the F-51 refused to vanish. Its endurance and loiter time made it invaluable for reconnaissance, artillery spotting, and strike coordination. In fact, it was the Mustang, not the Jetta, first perfected the modern concept of close air support. The coordination between air and ground that would later define conflicts in Vietnam and the Middle East began here, in the valleys of Korea, under the slow, steady hum of a propeller. In January 1953, the United States officially withdrew the F-51 from frontline American service. Its time in the spotlight had ended, but not its legacy. The Republic of Korea Air Force continued flying Mustangs for years afterward, long after the ceasefire. For young Korean pilots, the Mustang wasn't a relic, it was a teacher. It taught them endurance, precision, and respect, values that would carry their Air Force into the modern age. Looking back, historians often describe the F-51 as a stopgap, a temporary bridge between the old world and the new. But for the men who flew it, the Mustang was something far more personal. It was the sound of the past, refusing to fade the heartbeat of a generation that had already fought one war and was somehow asked to fight another. Each mission felt like a quiet act of defiance against obsolescence, against despair, against time itself. The F-51 may not have been built for Korea, but Korea became its final proving ground. It wasn't the fastest plane in the sky, nor the toughest, nor the most advanced. But in those desperate early months, when nothing else could hold the line, it was the one aircraft that could stay circling, protecting, enduring. And in that endurance lay its greatness. The Mustang story in Korea wasn't about victory. It was about survival machines, of pilots, and of spirit. A second war for an old fighter that simply refused to die. If the Mustang was the workhorse of Korea, the Corsair was its hammer, loud, powerful, and utterly unbreakable. To those who saw it land on the deck of a carrier, the F4U looked like a creature from another age, its bent gull wings folding skyward, its propeller the size of a windmill. The engine, Pratt & Whitney's R2800 Double Wasp, wasn't elegant. It was raw muscle wrapped in steel, built to take punishment and still claw its way home. When the war began, the Navy and Marine Corps still had squadrons of Corsairs, veterans of the Pacific. Most of them had spent years patrolling the ocean, their paint chipped by salt and Sunday. Now, They were heading toward a new battlefield, a cold, mountainous peninsula few of them could find on a map. But in Korea, the Corsair found its second calling. While the Mustang fought from muddy strips on land, the Corsair came roaring from the sea. From the decks of carriers like USS Valley Forge and USS Boxer, Marine and Navy pilots launched before dawn, their engines shaking the ocean beneath them. They carried bombs, rockets, and napalm, sometimes as much as 5,000 pounds of ordnance strapped to those broad blue wings. Their mission was simple and brutal: clear the beaches before the troops landed. On September 15, 1950, during the Incheon landings, the Corsair became legend again. As General MacArthur's invasion fleet closed in, enemy artillery along the coast opened fire. The sky filled with black bursts of flak. Then came the Corsairs. Pilots from VMF 214, the Black Sheep, once led by Greg "Pappy" Boyington, dived through clouds of smoke and tracer fire, unleashing HVAR rockets and streams of .50 caliber bullets into gun emplacements and bunkers. Below, Marines watched the ridgeline explode in flames as napalm canisters tumbled from the sky. The flames cleared paths for the landing craft, the heat bending the air itself. In those moments, the Corsair wasn't just an airplane, it was thunder given wings. The aircraft's design, once criticized for its tricky landings, turned out to be perfect for Korea. Its inverted wings allowed space for a massive propeller while keeping the landing gear short and strong. That meant it could survive the rough, uneven decks of carriers and the pounding shocks of low-altitude attacks. And unlike the liquid-cooled engines of the Mustang, the Corsair's big radial heart could take hits and keep turning. Many pilots limped home with holes the size of fists in their wings, oil spraying across their windshields, and yet their engines never quit. It was a machine that refused to die before its pilot did. As the war dragged into the mountains, Corsairs took on new roles: night strikes, convoy hunting, and close support for ground troops pinned under fire. They operated in conditions no jet could endure: snow, freezing winds, and the dense, low clouds of Korean winters. One pilot later wrote that flying the Corsair felt like driving a truck through hell with a flamethrower strapped to the hood. He meant it as a compliment. Each mission blurred the line between naval precision and sheer brawling survival. Corsairs attacked trains racing through mountain passes, fuel depots hidden in valleys, and artillery batteries camouflaged under trees. They flew so low that the shockwave from their own rockets sometimes rattled the cockpit. In those conditions, speed didn't matter. Endurance did. And few aircraft could stay over the front longer or hit harder than the Corsair. But the price, as always, was paid in lives. Carrier decks became small worlds of exhaustion and grief. Pilots returned with bullet holes and missing wing panels, sometimes landing on one wheel, sometimes not at all. On the flight decks, sailors worked in near silence, clearing wreckage before the next launch cycle. There was no time for mourning, only refueling, rearming, and flying again. For every Corsair that made it home, another never did. Still, morale remained fierce. Marine ground units learned to trust that unmistakable silhouette overhead. To them, the Corsair meant help had arrived. When a squad pinned down by enemy fire radioed for air support, the sound that came next to the deep radial growl felt like salvation. Sometimes, a Corsair would drop so low the pilots and troops could see each other wave. In many ways, the F4U service in Korea mirrored its pilots' own journey. Both were older than the world around them, both underestimated, both still burning with purpose. And together, they proved that age meant nothing in the face of necessity. By the time jets like the F9F Panther began to dominate carrier operations, Corsair had already left its mark. It remained on the front lines longer than anyone expected through Incheon, through Seoul, through the frozen hell of Chosin Reservoir, until finally, in 1953, it began to fade from combat duty. Yet even in retirement, its legend lingered. The Corsair was the last major piston-engine fighter-bomber to serve the United States. It bridged two worlds, one of steel and propellers, the other of jets and afterburners, and did it with dignity. Its curved wings became a symbol of endurance, its roar a reminder of when strength and simplicity could still turn the tide of battle. For the pilots who flew it, the Corsair was never obsolete. It was a friend that came back one last time to finish the fight. Among all the piston fighters reborn for Korea, none looked stranger or more futuristic than the F-82 Twin Mustang. It was the last American propeller-driven fighter built in large numbers, yet it looked like an experiment that had somehow escaped the lab. Two sleek Mustang fuselages joined by a single broad wing and tail, two engines humming in perfect harmony, and two cockpits side by side, one for the pilot, the other for a radar operator peering into a greenlit scope. It was half fighter, half phantom of the coming jet age. The Twin Mustang had been conceived at the very end of World War II as a long-range escort for B-29 bombers crossing the Pacific. By the time the first squadrons were ready, the war was over. Most sat idle, their silver skins dulling under peacetime dust. Then Korea happened, and suddenly the F-82 was exactly what the Air Force needed, a fighter that could fly all the way from Japan to Korea, stay there for hours, and fight in the dark when radar-equipped jets were still experimental. At dawn on June 27, 1950, the war's third day F-82S of the 68th Fighter All-Weather Squadron lifted off from Tazuko Air Base in Japan and crossed the Yellow Sea under low clouds. Somewhere over the peninsula, their radar scopes flickered with movement. A pair of North Korean La-7S and a Yak-11 had taken off to strafe retreating UN convoys. The Twin Mustangs dived, engines screaming in duet. Moments later, bursts of .50 caliber fire stitched through the grey sky. When the smoke cleared, 3 enemy planes were falling in flames. Those were the first aerial victories of the Korean War, won not by jets, but by the last propeller fighters America would ever build. For the next few months, the F-82S flew everything: night interception, bomber escort, reconnaissance, even ground attack. They patrolled the evacuation routes from Suwon to Incheon, covering the desperate withdrawal of UN personnel. In storms and darkness, their radar operators searched for enemy bombers that never came. The aircraft's range over 2,000 miles with drop tanks meant it could stay aloft long after the faster F-80S had turned back for fuel. Yet, the Twin Mustang was never truly comfortable in its own skin. It was too heavy for dogfights, too rare for spare parts, and too specialized for the rough airstrips of Korea. Maintaining 2 engines and 2 cockpits on one airframe was a mechanic's nightmare. Still, the crew loved it. Pilots described it as 2 Mustangs dancing together, smooth and steady even through turbulence. Radar operators called their side the blind cockpit, a world of flickering lights and radio whispers. Between them grew a bond as unique as the aircraft itself, a partnership built on trust, where one man saw the world outside and the other saw the invisible. Combat stories from those early missions carry a quiet intimacy. One night, over the Han River, a Twin Mustang was caught in a storm so violently the lightning flashed between its twin tails. The radar operator guided his pilot home by instinct alone, both men soaked in sweat, the instrument needles shaking. When they landed, the crew chief found bullet holes in one fuselage and shrapnel embedded in the other. 2 sides of one heart, both still beating. But by late 1951, jet age finally overtook it. The F-94 Starfire, America's first true radar interceptor, entered service. It could climb faster, see farther, and chase intruders higher than any piston plane. The Twin Mustang's era had lasted barely a year. When the last F-82s were retired in 1952, few noticed, yet its legacy remained profound. It bridged the gap between the muscles of World War II and the precision of the Cold War, a symbol of transition, ingenuity, and courage. In its mirrored fuselages, you could see two eras flying side by side, sharing one final mission before parting forever. For the men who flew it, the memory of that dual heartbeat never faded. They said the F-82 didn't just have two engines, it had two souls, one reaching back to the propeller age and one stretching forward into the jet age. And for a brief, luminous moment over Korea, those two souls flew together, perfectly balanced between what had been and what was yet to come. If the Mustang was the hero and the Corsair the warrior, then the WWII Skyraider was the brute, slow, heavy, and almost indestructible. It didn't glide through the sky so much as dominate it. When a Skyraider appeared over the battlefield, everyone noticed. The soldiers below felt the ground shake. The men in the cockpits felt every bolt in the airframe tremble with raw power. And the enemy learned that when the Skyraider arrived, there was nowhere left to hide. Designed too late for World War II, the Skyraider was built for a kind of war that no longer existed, one where carriers launched wave after wave of piston-engine dive bombers. By the time it was ready, jets had taken over. But Korea, like history itself, had a way of resurrecting what the world thought it no longer needed. When the Navy dusted off the Skyraider in 1950, they didn't expect much. What they got was the most versatile attack aircraft of the entire war. The Skyraider was an anomaly in the jet age, a single-seat propeller aircraft carrying more bombs than a four-engine World War II bomber. 15 hardpoints hung under its broad wings, loaded with rockets, torpedoes, and up to 8,000 pounds of ordnance. It could loiter for 10 hours, circle over a target like a hawk, and strike with surgical precision. While jets came and went in minutes, the Skyraider simply stayed waiting, watching, and pounding the enemy until the smoke cleared. Its pilots called it the Sped, an affectionate nod to the lumbering French fighter of the First World War. The name fit perfectly. Like its namesake, the Skyraider was simple, rugged, and deadly. Its massive Wright R3350 radial engine produced 2,700 horsepower, and it could absorb punishment that would destroy any other plane. There are stories of Skyraiders returning to carriers with control surfaces shot away, holes in the fuselage big enough to crawl through, even missing entire cylinders from the engine and still landing safely. It was less an aircraft and more a flying tank, but toughness alone didn't make it special. What truly defined the Skyraider was its purpose. It wasn't built to chase MiGs or patrol the upper atmosphere. It was built to protect the men on the ground, the infantry trapped in valleys, the Marines pinned under fire, the pilots shot down behind enemy lines. In that role, it became a legend. The USS Valley Forge was among the first carriers to launch Skyraiders into combat over Korea. Their targets were as varied as their payloads: bridges, fuel depots, railways, and artillery nests hidden deep in the mountains. One mission struck the Yalu River bridges that carried vital supplies from China. Another targeted the Hashan Dam in what would become the only aerial torpedo attack of the entire war. At low altitude, the Spades screamed through anti-aircraft fire, dropping ordnance so precisely that ground commanders began requesting them by name. When soldiers heard that Skyraiders were inbound, morale surged instantly. Their reputations spread fast. If you can hear that engine, you're going to make it out. For rescue teams, the Skyraider was more than air cover, it was salvation. During combat search and rescue missions, they escorted helicopters into enemy territory, diving again and again to suppress ground fire. Their endurance meant they could linger long after others turned back for fuel. Sometimes, a Skyraider pilot would fly so close to the treetops that his wingtips sliced through branches just to protect the crew below. One of the most famous missions occurred in late 1952, when a downed pilot was surrounded by enemy troops in the mountains north of Pyongyang. Jets couldn't stay long enough to help, but two Skyraiders, low on fuel, refused to leave. For more than an hour, they strafed every approach, burning through rockets, cannon shells, and napalm. When the rescue helicopter finally arrived, the pilot was still alive, and the Skyraiders, both riddled with holes, somehow limped back to base. Stories like that spread through the ranks, transforming the Skyraider from just another airplane into a legend of loyalty. Unlike the Mustang or the Corsair, the Skyraider was never beautiful. It was broad-shouldered, heavy, almost primitive, yet there was something reassuring about it. In an age obsessed with speed, it proved that staying power mattered more. It was the kind of aircraft that didn't need to be admired. It needed to be trusted. By the end of the Korean War, the Skyraider had flown thousands of sorties, delivered millions of pounds of ordnance, and earned the love of every soldier it ever saved. It wasn't perfect, it was slow, loud, and about as graceful as a bulldozer, but it never failed to bring its pilot home. Even as jets took over, commanders quietly admitted that no modern aircraft could replace it for close air support. The irony was that the Skyraider's greatest moment was yet to come. Years later, in Vietnam, it would rise again, carrying the same spirit, the same endurance, and the same respect from the troops below. But its story began here, over the cold mountains of Korea, where it proved that courage isn't measured in knots or altitude, it's measured in how long you're willing to stay in the fight. When historians write about air power, they often mention speed, altitude, and technology. But the Skyraider taught another lesson, that sometimes the future still needs the past. In a sky filled with silver jets, it was the slow, thunderous sound of a propeller that gave men on the ground their greatest weapon, hope. While American forces revived their old warriors, the North Koreans and their Soviet allies did the same. Among the first aircraft to bear the Red Star over Korea was the Yakovlev Yak-9, a fighter already a legend in the Soviet Union, but one that was aging fast. By the time the Korean War erupted in June 1950, the Yak-9 had already fought its great battles over Stalingrad and Berlin. It was the Soviet equivalent of the Mustang, light, agile, and built in staggering numbers. More than 16,000 had rolled out of factories during World War II. It was the kind of plane that could be built in a barn and repaired in a field, and that was precisely why it was chosen for North Korea's young Air Force. At first, the Yak-9 looked like a good fit. It was simple to maintain, could take off from rough strips carved into mountain valleys, and could be flown by pilots with only a few months of training. Its wooden wings and hybrid fuselage made it forgiving to damage and to pilot mistakes, and in the early days of the war, when UN forces had few planes in the air, the Yak-9 briefly ruled the Korean skies. In June and July of 1950, Yak-9s of the 56th Fighter Aviation Regiment roared south in formation, their engines echoing across rice paddies and mountain ridges. They strafed convoys, blasted airfields at Kimo and Suwon, and attacked trains carrying refugees and supplies. At low altitude, they were fast, nimble, and deadly. To the UN soldiers retreating toward the Busan perimeter, those grey-green silhouettes became a symbol of terror. The Yak-9's heavy 37mm cannon could tear through trucks, jeeps, even small ships. Its machine guns raked roads with relentless precision, but the Yak-9's moment of dominance was short. brutally short. Within weeks, the Americans brought in their own veterans, the F-51 Mustangs, and the first jet fighters, the F-80 Shooting Stars. Against them, the Yak-9's flaws became painfully clear. It was slower, less armored, and carried too little ammunition for sustained combat. Its climb rate lagged behind, its range limited, and its airframe made of wood and fabric ignited far too easily under .50 caliber fire. Dogfights over the Korean hills were brief and brutal. The Yak-9 could outturn a jet in a tight circle, but never outrun one, and while its cannons hit hard, they fired too slowly to make up the difference. In one encounter near Taijon, a flight of F-51 Mustangs caught a group of Yaks strafing a road. The result was devastating. 5 Yak-9s destroyed in under 2 minutes. From that moment, the tide of air superiority shifted for good. By August, the Yak units were suffering catastrophic losses. UN jets prowled the skies, cutting down any aircraft that dared cross the 38th parallel. The once proud Yak-9s were forced to retreat northward, hidden under camouflage nets or buried in snow. Those that remained in action flew only at night, their engines coughing in the cold, their pilots straining to find targets in the dark. They became nuisance raiders, dropping small bombs on UN positions, harassing convoys, and vanishing before dawn. The damage they caused was minor, but the defiance behind it was unmistakable. To their pilots, most of them barely 20 years old, the Yak-9 wasn't obsolete. It was all they had. They fought not with expectation of victory, but out of duty and pride in a machine their fathers had used to defeat the Nazis just 5 years earlier. In interviews decades later, a North Korean pilot recalled, "We knew the enemy was faster, stronger, better equipped, but the Yak-9 was ours. We trusted her. That trust carried them into hopeless fights, and too often into fire." By the end of 1950, the Yak-9 had vanished from daylight skies. A handful remained in training units, teaching new pilots the basics before they transitioned to jets like the MiG-15. But even in its twilight, the Yak had one final role to play. Captured examples were studied by American and British engineers who admired its simplicity and clever use of materials. It was, as one U.S. officer described, a warplane designed for a nation that built from scarcity, proof that necessity breeds genius. In the grand scope of the Korean conflict, the Yak-9 story seems small, brief flash between eras. But it carries a powerful echo. It represents the last breath of the propeller age in the communist bloc, a time when craftsmanship and improvisation could still hold their own against machines of metal and speed. The Yak-9 came too late to change the war. But in those early weeks, when the skies were still uncertain and every mile of ground was paid for in blood, it burned brightly, only for a moment before the jets swept it aside. Before the jet engine redefined combat, there was one aircraft that embodied the old idea of survival through strength, the Ilyushin IL-10, known by its crews as the Turmoil, and by its enemies as the Flying Tank. It was a machine built for endurance, not elegance. When it appeared in the skies over Korea in the summer of 1950, it was already a veteran design, an evolution of the feared IL-2 that had terrorized German armor during the Second World War. The Soviets had taken everything they'd learned about keeping a pilot alive under fire and wrapped it into this aircraft. The result was an armored monster that looked more like a locomotive with wings than a fighter. The IL-10's design philosophy was brutally simple: survive the mission. The cockpit, engine, and vital systems were encased in a bathtub of steel up to 8 millimeters thick. Inside that armored shell, the pilot and rear gunner sat shoulder to shoulder, one guiding the attack, the other fending off enemy fighters with a single 12.7 millimeters gun. The aircraft carried two powerful 23mm cannons and up to half a ton of bombs and rockets. It couldn't outrun anything, but it didn't need to. It was designed to dive straight through anti-aircraft fire, deliver its payload, and claw its way home or die trying. When the Korean War began, roughly 70 IL-10S were delivered to the North Korean Air Force, forming the 57th Assault Aviation Regiment. They flew low, almost brushing the treetops, striking UN convoys and artillery positions across the southern front. Early on, their effect was shocking. Columns of UN trucks and tanks burned in the valleys north of Busan. The IL-10's armor shrugged off small arms fire, and its cannons shredded everything below. To the soldiers pinned under its shadow, it felt unstoppable ghost from another war suddenly come back to life. But that illusion didn't last long. Once American air power surged into the theater, the IL-10's vulnerabilities became clear. Jets like the F-80 and F-84 could climb faster than the IL-10 could even react. Corsairs and Mustangs hunted them relentlessly, ambushing them on their return to base. Unlike the Yak-9, the IL-10 couldn't even attempt to escape. It could only absorb punishment. And though its armor could withstand rifle and machine gun fire, it was no match for the half-inch rounds of the F-51's 6 guns or the high-explosive rockets the Corsairs carried. Still, the pilots of the 57th Regiment fought with remarkable resolve. Many had trained under Soviet instructors who'd flown over Kursk and Berlin, and they brought that same grim determination to Korea. They flew multiple sorties a day, even as fuel ran low and spare parts vanished. Each mission was an act of sacrifice. They flew through flak, clouds, and freezing rain, often returning with wings shredded and glass cracked, but engines still roaring. One mission over the Nakong River became infamous. A flight of IL-10S dived on UN positions, releasing rockets into the smoke. Moments later, a formation of F-80S appeared, dropping from the Sunday. The jets tore through the slower aircraft before the gunners could even swing their turrets. Of the 8 IL-10S that took off that morning, only 2 returned. When the survivors landed, they found the sides of their cockpits pitted with dozens of bullet impacts, dents in steel that had saved their lives. By late 1950, attrition had done what bullets could not. Of the original regiment, fewer than 20 aircraft remained operational. Parts shortages, mechanical failures, and relentless UN bombing of airfields turned the once feared flying tank into a relic. The remaining IL-10S were pulled north, used for training or as decoys to draw Allied strikes away from more valuable jets. In the end, even their armor couldn't protect them from obsolescence. And yet, there's something tragic and noble in their story. The IL-10 symbolized the last gasp of an era when strength meant plates of steel, not radar locks or afterburners. Its pilots fought in a world that had already moved beyond them, clinging to a machine that answered courage with endurance. In their minds, armor was salvation, but in Korea, it became a burden. Speed, not protection, now ruled the sky. When the last IL-10S was scrapped in the mid-50s, few remembered their role in the war. But to those who had faced them and those who had flown them, the memory lingered. They were relics of a time when survival was hammered into metal and riveted to wings, when a pilot's faith rested not on electronics, but on inches of steel between him and death. The IL-10 was slow, crude, and doomed, but for a fleeting moment it stood defiant in the face of a future that no longer had room for armor. When the guns of Korea finally fell silent in July of 1953, the sky over the peninsula was quiet again, but it was not the same sky that had existed 3 years earlier. The propellers had stopped turning, the era they represented of piston engines, oil-stained uniforms, and battles fought by sound and feel had ended for good. The jet age had won. The F-86 Sabre and MiG-15 now defined the future, sleek, silver arrows that sliced through the clouds faster than thought itself. But hidden beneath those headlines, in the burned-out airfields and scarred mountain passes of Korea, lay the last great story of the machines that had built modern air warfare, the 6 prop-driven fighters that refused to go quietly. They had come from different worlds, American, Soviet, and everything in between, but they shared a common fate. They were all relics of a war that had never truly ended. The Mustang, the Corsair, the Twin Mustang, the Skyraider, the Yak-9, and the IL-106 aircraft born from World War II's fire, now fighting their final battles in a war no one expected them to survive. And yet, survive they did. For the Americans, these planes symbolized resilience. The Mustang returned from history's hangar to defend the Busan perimeter, its old heart roaring once more. The Corsair, scarred from the Pacific, found a new enemy and a new purpose on frozen shores. The Twin Mustang, strange and beautiful, bridged 2 eras in a single silhouette, and the Skyraider, that thunderous guardian, became the embodiment of loyalty between pilot and soldier. For the North Koreans and their Soviet mentors, the Yak-9 and the IL-10 represented something else: defiance. They flew in the face of impossible odds, powered not by technology but by determination. They knew they couldn't win the skies, but they flew anyway. And in doing so, they reminded the world that courage was never exclusive to one side. What united them all was not power, but persistence. Each of these aircraft fought against more than just the enemy. They fought against time itself. They were the ghosts of an older world, machines that belonged to piston and propeller, smoke and steel, thrust into a conflict of circuits and jet fuel. They weren't supposed to exist anymore, and yet they did long enough to prove that progress doesn't erase history, it builds upon it. In every war, there are battles no one celebrates. For every jet duel at 30,000 feet, there were men flying 1,000 feet above the ground, through wind and flak, their engines screaming and their hearts pounding. Those men carried the legacy of their fathers, the generation that had fought over Normandy, Iwo Jima, and Kursk, and they wrote its final chapter in the skies over Korea. After the armistice, the propeller fighters were quietly retired. Some were scrapped, some given to allied nations, and a few ended up in museums, silent, polished, preserved. Visitors who stand beside them today see only metal and rivets. But if you close your eyes, you can still hear the echo, the low, throaty hum of courage, measured not in speed, but in endurance. That was the gift of Korea's propeller warriors. They reminded the world that technology may evolve, but valor never goes out of date. Their engines turned in defiance of the inevitable, their propellers carving circles of resistance against the future. And when they finally stopped, the silence they left behind wasn't the sound of defeat, was the sound of completion. For more than a generation, these aircraft had carried men into fire and brought them home again. When the jets took over, it wasn't because they failed, it was because they had already done their job. They had proven what flight could mean, what a machine could endure, and how far a human heart could go when bound to a propeller. So, when history remembers the Korean War as the dawn of jet combat, it should also remember its twilight, the final roar of propellers echoing across the valleys of a divided land. Because in that sound, deep, thunderous, and fading the last breath of an age, the age of the propeller was ending, but the men who flew them would never be forgotten.